the loyalty to a company or to a position may sometimes clash
Hmm.
with your potential. So, is say for example, if somebody started as somebody in front desk in a small clinic, and there was something in that person, been there for 5 years, like, hey, I wanted to be a doctor,
Hmm.
and started working on that. Is that so wrong that you knew that it's time for you to move on?
How do you maybe reframe what your career might look like by the things that, yes, you like to do, but you can also make money at doing, right? And live on. We have to be careful, at least for me, I do, around the judgments that we place on certain decisions that we make. So even just in the example you were using there a moment ago, like let's say you were on this path, you were doing this job, and then you make a pivot. Does that mean what you were doing before is wrong? That label of it being wrong, that's judgment. We can do without that, I think, any of us, right? Because there's value, as you were also mentioning, in knowing what you don't want to do.
Welcome to Courageously Speaking, the podcast where we explore bold decisions, inspire transformative growth, and build the courage it takes to thrive in life's most challenging spaces. I'm your host, Maria Soriano, and today I am super excited because I'm about to interview such an extraordinary leader whose career journey redefines what it means to lead with resilience and purpose. Our guest, Willayna Banner, has over 2 decades of leadership experience spanning some of the most influential organizations in the world. In fact, Willayna Banner, served as the Senior Director and Global Head of Growth and Innovation for Retail, CPG, and Agriculture at Microsoft, where she drove cutting-edge solutions in artificial intelligence and cloud technology. Her other roles include leading Web3 and blockchain initiatives, also at Microsoft. And she also served on Morgan Stanley's Investor Advisory Committee for the Next Level Fund. And hey, even holding senior positions at Wells Fargo, Bank of America, American Express, again, Morgan Stanley, and HBO. With a career that, as you've heard, traversed tech, finance, and media, with the first 2 industries often known for their high pressure environments and where women are still underrepresented, Willayna has consistently broken barriers and led with purpose. Now, she actually embarks in this chapter of personal reinvention that I'm personally very excited to hear about. And she's proving that courage rooted in purpose is a constant thread in every success story. You know, in today's episode, we'll uncover how Willayna has navigated life's challenges and how she amplified her voice in the most difficult spaces, and what her journey can teach us about thriving and leading through change. So, whether you're building your career, stepping into uncharted territory, or just seeking inspiration to tackle that next big leap, this conversation is one that you don't want to miss. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Courageously Speaking podcast for more resources and inspiration to fuel your own courageous journey. Whew, that was a long introduction, and that doesn't even encapsulate everything you've done, so I apologize.
You're amazing.
So, Willayna, welcome to Courageously Speaking.
Hi. First of all, incredible intro. Thank you. I feel like you need to just come with me everywhere and do an intro when I have one. That was incredible. Thank you for your kind words. I am so happy to be here. Proud of you. And what an honor to also be the first to kick off with you season 2 for Courageously Speaking. So thanks for having me.
And thank you as well. And you know, Willayna, you've worked in some of the world's most competitive industries, and now you're charting in this new path in your personal life. What is your greatest motivation?
You know, it's right. You don't want to start to lean on the cliches of, well, I do want to make a difference and I do want to make change in the world and those things. And I actually do. I mean, earlier on in my career, it's, make your parents proud and make yourself proud and make good decisions and see how you can bring all your skills to bear. Anymore, and these days, it's really about, okay, how can I continue to stay in alignment with what is truly meant for me. And then, yes, of course, adding value to those along the way and doing it with people that I care about and that I'm inspired by. Because I've done a lot of things, and I'm grateful, if in my career and personally to have done these things. But you also know sometimes when you're like out of alignment, like, okay, is this next thing I may be thinking about really for me? What's my motivation for wanting to do that thing? Is that really what, God has for me, in my case, right? And so there are things there overall. If I had to encapsulate like one motivation, it's like, okay, just stay in alignment as best as possible.
But I feel like it's hard. And for me, I think I was sharing this with you
Yeah,
beforehand that sometimes we tie who we are with our titles. We work so
sure.
hard. We went to college for a long time, studied, worked so hard, move up the ladder, career ladder. And yet, this personal reinvention seemed to be difficult because we are so ingrained in who we are. Like when you're introduced to someone or you're introducing yourself, sometimes even if you evade that question or who, where you working, what you do, you're still asked that question.
Yeah, that's
So,
normally the question that a
right?
lot of
Like, what do you
people when
do,
they meet.
Willayna? And you're going to
Yeah,
say, oh, I'm the senior director and global head of
right.
growth and innovation for Microsoft. Sounds
Right.
great,
And
right?
and do people even know what the heck that means? Like,
I
what does
know.
that mean?
It was
You know
so
what I mean?
hard. I practiced that and memorized that yesterday 20 times because I hope I don't like mispronounce any of these. As you know, I'm ESL, so English is my second language.
Yes.
And I was like, I
Yeah.
still have those moments wherein certain words are mispronounced. And that was like a long title, but I think it's metaphorical. It's a long title. It shows that you have done a lot in your life to get to that position in Microsoft. But
Mm.
how do you combat that of like you're being tied to this is Willayna and this is her. She works in tech or she works in media or she works in finance. Like how do you keep that balance of not ever losing who you are and still be great at what you do?
Yeah, I think the balance word that you mentioned there is really key, right? Like for me, I can't always just decouple those things, and I think that's okay, right? Like part of who I am is also part of, the body of work over time that I've done and who I've become along the way through that and who I've met that's influenced me and helped me be who I am and that type of thing. And so all of those experiences are still me. The fact that, there may be a title here or a title there at this company or that company, like that's fine. And those things also change. But who I am at the core is the thread that flows through any title, any company, any organization. And I think, for your listeners, maybe too, like that's maybe something to really anchor on because it doesn't have to be a decoupling. In fact, I would actually say all of that is you, like all of that is you. And I think that's perfectly fine.
And I love that. I think that's the hashtag integrated life. That
That's
you're
right.
not Willayna from tech or just Willayna as a person, you're Willayna
Yeah.
in all of these facets in life.
Yes,
And,
for
and I think
sure.
that's powerful. Thank you for that. And let's talk about the challenges you've faced in a high pressured industry, like a tech or even finance, where women are still underrepresented. What were some of the toughest barriers you encountered early in your career?
It's funny. There's a story that always comes to mind around something that was so transformative for me. Right when I started my career in investment banking full time, I was 22, right? And so at that time, any of us as investment banking analysts, we had admins, secretaries as well that helped support us, specifically, as well as the rest of the team. And that's important to the story. And so I was going to this event with a couple other analysts, and there were a couple of managing directors, very senior leaders as well, walking to this event. And I found myself walking next to this managing director, who, of course, I knew who he was, but he didn't know who I was, right? I mean, I was new to the team and that type of thing. So that's okay. And we're walking to this event, and we're all just kind of chatting in a group as we're walking there in Times Square. And he says something to the effect of, "Oh, perhaps my admin so and so," because the inference he was making, or the assumption, was that I must be a secretary, because I'm just not sure if maybe he'd ever met a Black female investment
Can you
banking
repeat that for
analyst.
me? What?
Yes. So this managing director made a statement to me to the effect of, perhaps I know his admin. And the assumption there is that I must also be an admin because, of course,
Wow.
the admins know each other, and that perhaps I knew his admin. And this, I think, was his way of trying to connect with me, versus just asking me what I did at the firm. And so when I heard the question, I immediately knew kind of why he was probably asking that. But I also, in that moment, at 22 years old, had to decide if I was going to like let it go, or what do I say next, and that type of thing. Because being an admin, a secretary, that's a perfectly wonderful profession. It just wasn't mine, right? And to your point around, how hard we work and we get in these places and spaces, it's like, no, I actually really worked hard to be an investment banking analyst here. And so in that moment, I decided to say, and this was true, something like, actually, no, I don't know so and so, his admin, but I'll ask my admin when I get back to the office, and maybe she can introduce us. And then I just looked at him and just kind of paused. And he looked at me, and he understood, just like I understood what I was saying. And he just kind of smiled, but I could see kind of the shock sink in a little bit, and the surprise. And it wasn't rude or, confrontational, but I think it was important for both of us in that moment, in my mind, for me to speak up in my own way for myself around who I actually was and who I wasn't. And for him, maybe if, he hadn't met someone in that position who looked like me, or he was assuming that someone who looked like me could have only had a certain role, that he also could perhaps be challenged, if that were his bias. And so the day went on from there, and it was totally fine, and everything was great. But that stuck with me so much throughout my entire career, around not only it happening, but I was proud of myself in that moment for just not letting it go. Because when you think about being true to yourself, and when you think about how you show up authentically, it's okay with dignity, right? But to be able to say a thing, and feel like you're understood or seen or heard, and that you belong.
Yeah.
And so that one was a critical one for me, very earliest in my career as I was starting full time.
But I
Yeah.
love how you said, I didn't let it go, but I also didn't hear you say, I'm going to lash out and how dare you ask me. I love that balance in you. I think the first time we've talked, you already exuded that balance. We're in, you're using wisdom. You're using an opportunity to educate, and showing how courageous you are and smart you are about not using this as a way for you to lash out. It's like, oh, this again. Like, some people would react that way, but I love your reaction. And a lot of our younger generation can learn from that. It's like picking your battles, but at the same time, if you are being assertive, it's different from being aggressive, you know?
1000%.
Right?
That's bar. That's a bar right there. That's absolutely right. And it's such a critical balance. And I think sometimes it takes a little bit of nuance, right? Because, we all also make mistakes, right? And so some of it could be in that moment, maybe I, was a little too brash in the way I said something, or other times, which is also a feeling I've had before that nobody wants, is, oh man, I wish I would have said something and I didn't. And for me, I do everything I can not to have that second feeling, because then you're just spinning in your mind about the things you would have said. But not for nothing, I think, whether it's early in your career, and in my case, like that was a key example, or even much later in your career, and you're still in these spaces where perhaps you don't see a whole lot of people that look like you, or you're still trying to figure things out, but at a more senior place in your career, a more tenured place in your career. There was this other situation, which I'll also never forget. And at this point, I'm an executive, still in financial services, and we have these standing weekly calls. And it was a contentious type of call just based on the topic, because we were solving like consent orders and these issues that were happening at the bank. Anyway, we have the standing weekly call. And there actually were maybe 3 or 4 women on that call, me included, who were also executives, and of course, several men. And there was one man in particular who talked over everybody. Now, he's actually a really good guy. Let's call him Tim. Okay, really good guy, right? Like, I really don't think he was doing this on purpose, but I would notice, and other women as well did too, that he would actually talk over the women mostly when we were on these calls. And so I'd be getting pinged on the side, like, oh, Tim's doing it again, blah, blah, blah. And as it's happening in real time, I'm pinging back, like, well, say something, like, speak up and say something. But no one ever did. The women that were pinging me on the side never did. They would just kind of lament that this was happening. And so one day, Maria, it happened to me. Like he kind of started talking over me. So, I start speaking literally within the first 5 seconds. As I'm trying to articulate my thought, he jumps in and starts talking over me. Now, when this happened in the past with other people, the person would stop talking. And so he would just kind of keep going. In this case, he starts talking over me, and I keep talking. And so I'm talking and he's talking over me. And now we're both talking. Nobody can understand anything we're saying. I'm sure it was super awkward for everyone. And we're just going to keep going, because I'm thinking I'm not going to stop talking. So either he's going to stop because I was talking anyway, or it's just going to be weird for everyone. So for a little while, it was weird probably for everyone. And then he still wasn't stopping. And so I start calling his name, and I very calmly, and I said, Tim. And I just very metered, I keep calling his name as he's just going. And finally he stops. He hears his name and he stops. And I say, Tim, so I'm going to finish what I started saying. And then once I'm finished, I'm going to hand the mic over to you, and then you can go, because I really want to hear what you have to say. But if we're both talking at the same time, nobody can understand what either one of us are saying. How does that work for you? And then I waited for his response. And he was very contrite. He was like, oh, no problem. Sure, Willayna, that's fine. And so I was like, great. And so I start talking again. I finish, and I hand it over to him, proverbially, right? I mean, we're on a call. I'm like, Tim, over to you. Please share with us what you'd like to share. And then he starts. And then it was fine. Now, mind you, my side chat's blowing up. Oh my gosh, good on you. You did it, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But the key thing is, Tim never did that again in that meeting.
Because and we all know teeth. There was a teeth into what you were saying. That's the assertiveness. But you were not aggressive to just say, why are you interrupting me all the time? You've been doing this with other people. So I like the fact, like, your strategy was to give grace to the person, but at the same time, not allow the person to do what they're doing, because you both deserve respect, and everybody in the call deserves respect. And perhaps he didn't know that he doesn't know that he's doing that all the time.
I really don't think he realized. I really don't, because it never happened again. And in fact, the inverse happened, in that, like, in the subsequent calls, he would be very deferential. So if, we both start talking at the same time. Like he'd be the first one to be like, oh, my bad, please go first, type of thing. So like he really like kind of just not only stopped that behavior, but it became very deferential, and there were no
And
more
that's
issues.
education.
Yeah,
That's
but I
education.
really just don't think, to be honest, because he's a really good guy. I just really don't think he knew. But to the point, if the behavior just continued and continued, then others were just going to be upset and like chatting on the side and not really addressing it. And so that's never a good outcome either.
I love how good you are in communicating your thoughts with, like, again, assertiveness, but respect. You should totally write a book that has how to communicate with difficult people. These are sample sentences that people can use, because I'm telling you, a lot of us can learn from that. So thank you for sharing. But
Very kind. I don't
now,
always get it right, but there's a few times where
yeah, it's the practice,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
practice. So people recognize you, and you had positions people can only dream of having. But I want to ask you this question if you're ready. Who
Okay.
is Willayna?
Who is Willayna? Um, well, again, thank you for the kind words and the accolades. They're nice and all, but yeah, at the heart of it, Willayna is a dreamer. Um, Willayna is a wife and a bonus mom and a daughter and a sister and an auntie and a godmother and a friend. Um, I actually think all of us, any one of us, have a uniqueness and gifts that only we can bring to the world. Um, and so, sure, perhaps I have some of those unique gifts too, but like on a humanist level, I'm just like everybody else. I have my own fears. I have my anxious moments, right, from time to time, all the rest of that stuff. So that's who Willayna
I'm
is.
interested to know. You said you have my own anxieties, my own
Sure.
fears. If I may ask, can you give us an example? Because in our interview and in our past conversations, I didn't see a lot of that fear come out, so it's natural
And you
for people
wouldn't.
outside. It's like,
Yes.
oh, she's like
Yes.
very confident.
Yes. You wouldn't see those things typically. Most people wouldn't. I actually think, and to answer your question, I mean, fears, anxieties, that can be anything like, imposter syndrome. That can be, am I really supposed to be in whatever environment? That can be, am I really who I think I am? It can be any number of those things, right? I also believe, though, that words have power. And I also believe that the more sometimes you speak about and ruminate on and think through some of those fears and anxious things or whatever, they take on a shape of their own. They balloon and get much bigger than perhaps they should have. And that there likely could be a different way, in many cases, not all cases, but to reframe how any of us think about the fear and anxiety and anxiousness and those things. So you're absolutely right. You and I have had some really great offline conversations that were very vulnerable as well, but most people would not see that. And that's by design, because there's also certain things that I want to personally speak about and give life to, and then other things that I wouldn't.
Yeah, that's very powerful, and I think that every person has a different level of openness or privacy. And
Sure.
some, like for me, I don't usually share a lot of my fears unless I knew that fear that I'm sharing is going to add value to other people's lives, and not
Mhm.
just dump into people things that will worry them, especially because they love me.
Yes.
But I have to strike a balance though, because you also don't want to be alone. and
That's
if
right.
you need someone to cry on. That's why you have that close circle of friends or family who you can depend on, you know?
That's right.
Do you have that,
I
Willayna?
do. I'm so grateful. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And I think you're spot on too, because, if you're a person that, let's say in your circle, even people depend on a lot as well, and seen as like the strong one, that can also sometimes mean that when you need help, people may not always know how to help you
100%.
because they think you got it, because maybe you're the one they're
Has that
normally
happened to you?
for support. For sure. For sure. I've had to learn how to ask for help because I'm not usually the one that asks for a whole lot of help. There's a vulnerability there, sure, in asking, but there's also the self discovery that you even need help with something, right? So again, that's the courageous piece, right? That's, I'm sure, what you're trying to work towards, every day, every podcast. How can you get to that place where you're still being authentic, you're able to show up in places and spaces where you feel confident, and at the same time, like a duck on water where their little feet are just going a mile a minute under the water, like that's okay. That's absolutely okay.
I am wondering, what is your why? Because I've seen you move industries from you worked in American Express, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley. I saw HBO there, and then Microsoft. Like, what is your why in doing what you're doing amidst those changes? Because sometimes people
Yeah.
think like, well, you're changing industries. Maybe you don't know your why, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Right? So I'm very
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah, yeah. It's such a great question. I have made some very intentional pivots, and a lot of them are different from each other. Uh, if I had to think about the why that wraps around all of it, it would be, my why is trying to figure out the what's next, meaning what's next for me in terms of the skills I want to learn, the industry and space I find interesting, the people that I might want to do that next thing with, all the way to like macroeconomic factors about what's next for that particular industry. What is that industry going to need? What's going to be, emerging technology, or what's going to be that next disruptive thing that's going to be important for that industry in that space. So that's how I think about kind of all of it in my career. But I also was very mindful, and continue to be as much as possible in my career, thinking about, I actually never just wanted to be kind of pigeonholed in one thing. I'm one of those people that's like equally left and right brained, like standardized tests, my SATs, I was like straight down the middle, right? In terms of, verbal and math and that type of thing. And so when I think about the things that interest me or inspire me, the what's next from the macro levels down to what I can do about it, I wanted to be able to be seen as a fungible leader that could be put in different positions and in different companies, industries, et cetera, and add value and excel there. And so part of that also is just proving that out to myself as well. So that's been kind of fun.
So you're saying that it's not necessarily bad moving different industries because I've heard some friends or colleagues that said, I don't know why certain people in our work they keep changing jobs, or like maybe that's said of a lot of the millennials, for examples, or Gen Zs. They can't keep a job. And then some people I've talked to, I'm a millennial, and I teach a lot of millennials and Gen Zs at the university, and they have similar experiences, and I don't see them as fickle-minded. They're just different in the way they think. They think that sometimes the loyalty to a company or to a position may sometimes clash with your potential. So it's say, for example, if somebody started as somebody in front desk in a small clinic, and there was something in that person, been there for 5 years, like, hey, I wanted to be a doctor
Mm,
and started working on that. Is that so wrong that you knew that it's time for you to move on, right? And
mhm.
so what I'm saying is that what is your message to our youth or young people who may have been told many times by the generations before them that you should be more loyal to your company, you should be more loyal to your position, and be humble and not be too ambitious. I've been
Mm.
called that many times. I was
That
told
you've been called too ambitious?
too ambitious. Like you should know your lane, and
Wow,
we just care about you. So just think about that,
sure.
and that's like a thing for me growing up, being here and moving from another country,
Sure.
saying that you know that you don't need to do all of these things. You can just work a 9 to 5 job and be happy. And here I
Hmm.
am having my own business,
Yes,
having a podcast.
thriving,
It's like,
killing the
yeah,
game.
what is
Yes, you
wrong with
are.
you, Maria? You're not ever happy. But I was not ever, I'm happy. I just know there's something out there. I'm not saying everybody should just quit their jobs right now, Willayna.
Sure.
But I'm just saying, what is your message for our young people who are just trying to figure out what they need to do and they're confused with people saying you should do what you love and you should know your potential and at the same time don't be too ambitious.
Yeah, gosh, there's so much to unpack there in that question. So the first thing that comes to mind, because you said it twice, and I kind of cringed a little bit hearing that, and I totally can understand where it might be coming from. Someone saying, you're too ambitious, kind of stay in your lane, keep your head down, etc. Someone that might say that to you or any of us, I think the first step is try to lean in with grace and know that that's probably coming from a place of someone who cares about you, someone who wants to keep you safe, and someone who doesn't want you to be hurt or disappointed, right? By perhaps doing something else or getting out of your lane. So that's kind of the first thing that strikes me. The other, though, is if that's been said to you, especially by a generation maybe that's older than you, we have to think about again what place that's coming from. So, you know, even my own parents, right? Like being in a generation where you could be at a job potentially, spend your whole career there as an example, and then get a pension and these types of things, right? Like that's how a lot of Americans, that's what they were striving to do and striving to have. um, Anymore, pensions are not as prolific and available as they once were. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in, right? Just as one example. This notion that, okay, go to a company and be there for the rest of your career, that's kind of not really a thing. It's just more rare today than it was, let's say, 20, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, because I've been in companies personally, gone into organizations where the sentiment was there are people who have been in these seats a really long time. And those people who have been in their seats a long time don't know what they're doing anymore because they're not keeping up with the current trends and what needs to happen now. And so, Willayna, we need you to go in there and kind of disrupt things and kind of right size the ship. I've heard this sentiment before going into companies. And so, all of that to say, for someone who's still trying to figure it out, and we all are, to be fair, give yourself some grace, give the people around you some grace, but to the point, finding the passion about what you want to do, that's a hard thing. I mean, there's a lot of people that, and I'm sure you talk to them as well all the time at the university level, who selected a major, and then ended up going into a field that's totally different. That's absolutely okay. And that happens as well all the time. So maybe it's, how do you focus on what types of problems do you like to solve? How do you maybe reframe what your career might look like by the things that, yes, you like to do, but you can also make money at doing, right? And live on. I personally had a passion for acting and singing and dancing, all these things, right? I just knew I was going to be on Broadway one day, et cetera. I was on Broadway, but I was in investment banking on Broadway. There was a Broadway address right in Midtown in New York City. That's absolutely okay, because maybe there's talents or other things that I was doing when I was acting all the way through college that I can now do when I'm doing a speaking engagement, or when I'm, doing something else, presenting to a client or talking about an idea, that I can still use those types of skills. But I knew for me that in the early days, I wasn't really trying to go through the struggling actress concept, especially when, I double majored in finance and international business and had been interning on Wall Street, right? And so just choices you make. Net, I think there are ways to maybe integrate some of your passions or things that you like to do and then still make a living as well. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've heard of the concept of ikigai, which is a Japanese philosophy. And for our listeners, Google ikigai, and this would really help a lot of you. There's this, if you're familiar with Venn diagram,
Yes.
The intersection of what you love to do, what you're good at, what brings value to the world, and what people are willing to pay you for. That's ikigai. And perhaps you didn't know what it's called, but that's exactly what you're saying is
Yes.
you had to make assessments. And I think there's power in exploration. When you're young, in your 20s, you explore a lot. And I think you can't know what you want and not want without exploring. You explored the artistic part of you or creative part of you, and you did that. But you also explored the analytical part of you. That's why you were in Wall Street.
Right.
And that's why you're dabbling in many places. You're in HBO, which is media and creative. You were in American Express, Bank of America. All of these are more analytical jobs. But you know what I've noticed is in all of those jobs, you have been reinventing yourself. You're not like, oh, this is just me pigeonholed in one. Your creative part comes out, and that's why you keep leveling up. And what I love about what you do is you don't, okay, I'm just going to be analytical and not be creative. No, in your position or positions, I've seen you handle things that needed both analytical and creative part of you. So I think if people, or especially our young listeners who are just figuring it all out, don't be afraid to fail, and don't be afraid to maybe follow your passion and then make a change, just like pivot. Because I think exploration is the first part of finding who you are. Without it, if you just listen to other people, you should be this.
Right.
That's when you followed it, you went to school for it, you even went to graduate school, and then you kept doing it after 20 years. You're still unfulfilled because you listen to others more than yourself. That doesn't mean you're not listening to others. It's just that you have to listen to you first and explore, assess. So explore, assess, make a choice, but also pivot and grow, because sometimes we may have chosen a path. Let's say you've chosen a path, right? And all your life where you work, it looks very interesting. It has like a certain trajectory, and then you pivoted. You're starting to change, right? Does that mean you were wrong all along? It wasn't. It was because now you're ready for the next step in your life, and that's totally okay. Right? It's totally okay. However, I know there's uncertainty when you're reinventing yourself, right? There's that sense of uncertainty. So how are you navigating that part when you're feeling uncertain? It doesn't feel well when you're uncertain, because when you have a job, I know I have this particular, however much I make, and I'm speaking for myself. Wherein I have a full-time job, I make this much money, and then suddenly I switch to being an entrepreneur. I have to start from scratch. It's uncertain. it feels a little, I feel a little unwell,
Sure.
but I also feel a little freed.
Yes.
And it's very crazy how that is. So tell me, how
Yes.
are you navigating through that
Yes.
uncertainty?
Right. Um, it's such a good question. And I love what you have done and are doing as you navigate through that as well in real time, because it's just such a living example. Um, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is we have to be careful, at least for me, I do, around the judgments that we place on certain decisions that we make.
Mm,
So, even just in the example you were using there a moment ago, like let's say you were on this path, you were doing this job, and then you make a pivot. Does that mean what you're doing before is wrong? That label of it being wrong, that's a judgment. We can do without that, I think, any of us, right? Because there's value, as you were also mentioning, in knowing what you don't want to do. That's equally as valuable, I think, as knowing what you do want to do. When it comes to uncertainty for me, I think there's the balance in how you look at it and the self discovery and the self talk of, okay, well, this could be scary. We could give that the label of scary, or it could also be exciting, right? The uncertainty in terms of how we're talking to ourselves could be, well, what happens if everything goes wrong? Or we could reframe that and say, what happens if everything works out exactly the way we thought it might? It's just literally the other side of that same coin. So the uncertainty piece for me is really grounding in not only why am I making a certain decision, but what's the self discovery that I'm going through around figuring out what I want to do, what I don't want to do. What are those feelings and things about myself that I might uncover that I didn't know were there? That doesn't mean it's good or bad. That's the judgment you place on top. It just means now I know more about myself. Okay, great. What am I going to do with that? And do I have the courage to go find out? Um, Uncertainty is everywhere, around the corner. Any one of us, we all have it. The future is uncertain. That is a statement of fact. That's absolutely fine. Now, how do we embrace that and say, okay, well, this could be really exciting? Okay, what happens if everything actually works out? Okay, what do I need to know or learn to feel more comfortable with what's next? That's a framing. I think that's a framing. I think that's a mindset. And it's looking at the exact same thing. It's like when people say, is the glass half full or not, right? Objectively, that is a glass with water in it. That's a statement of fact. That's it. Now, the judgment we place on top is it half full or is it half empty?
It's the way we
It's
see
it's
things.
just a
Yeah.
glass of water. You know what I mean? So there are ways that I think we can also talk to ourselves and with ourselves, give ourselves a little bit of grace there around how are we framing how we see something. That's all full within our control, which can I find comforting, even if there's unsettling things around us, or even if the future's uncertain.
Yes. And can you give us an example in a point in your life wherein you were uncertain, how you felt, and how you were able to overcome that feeling of uncertainty?
Sure. One of the interesting things, even at Microsoft in the last few years, like in my career, as you've seen and talked about, I was primarily in financial services, right, of varying kinds for, let's say, the first 20 years, financial services. And so making the change to Microsoft, at first, I was still pointed to, the financial services industry, and I was on an industry team within Microsoft as well. When I made the move into engineering to head up Web3 and blockchain for our product group team, I very much was like, okay, Willayna, you're not a traditional engineer, right? Like that's not your training. Like, how is it that you think you're going to go
How
into this
dare you get
engineering
there?
function, right? Like the belly of the beast at the largest company in the world at that time, and do this thing. Now, while I'd been living and breathing the Web3 and blockchain space for many years before that, and went through the interview process just like anyone else would, like all the things, and I was the person at the end. I absolutely had to work through the inner uncertainty of, oh my goodness, I am now in an organization that I am not familiar with at all, which on its own is fine because I've done that many other times in my career. But more times than not, most other people were or had a broader engineering like background than I did. The role I was in actually needed to have many different aspects other than just traditional engineering that came with it, which was great. And a lot of those things I had and could grow into and learn, et cetera. But I absolutely had to get through some of this inner, like, okay, I'm not a traditional engineer. And the thing that really made it work for me was embracing that I was absolutely there for a reason, but also that was my superpower. The fact that I wasn't a traditional engineer, that was absolutely my superpower because there's ways that I think about things, looking at that same glass of water. Maybe one of my colleagues might see it one way. I have a different lens and maybe see it a different way. There's value in bringing that perspective to the table because there's many a situation where I was in a discussion with a teammate or a customer or a client where I'm bringing a lens that is outside of maybe something that the traditional conversation, if it were all engineers on the phone, if you will, might have had. And so I absolutely leaned into that. Like that was actually a really great thing. And so for any of your listeners as well, or any of us that might be going through something where you're like, oh, I have a particular background in X, but I'm now going to move into Y, and that's a little bit different. Once you're there, remember all of the X part and bring that with you because the value of you having X and moving into Y is to not forget the X, but in fact, that can be your superpower and the lens and perspective that you're bringing forward that it could be nobody else has.
I was going to ask you a question, but hey, you already answered it about, how individuals can break into spaces where they feel like their unique background could be seen as a disadvantage. Because I've been there, I'm very creative and I worked in spaces that are very structured. And there was a point in my life I had to hide my real self, and I know it was wrong of me, but I was young and I didn't know if I was going to be accepted as a creative person in let's say in the academic world or in government, for example. I had to hide it because I might get in trouble for being too creative because I think in my first years being creative, it wasn't accepted. So it's like, I better not tell them that I can sing, just like you. I love singing. I have a song on Spotify, for example. Like it's a hobby, but I do shows in the weekends here and there, opening for some concerts. And I had to hide that. And it didn't sit well with me, but I had to do it to survive. And then I realized if I am in the right place, they would accept me. So I started I had to have that safe circle wherein I tell my colleagues, my favorite people, like, hey, I have to tell you a secret. If you can have lunch together, and I say, hey, I sing, I do this, and that, and I thought I'm gonna lose my friends at work. It's like, how dare you, like that? No, they were in my show supporting me, buying tickets for concerts, and I'm not kidding you. That same creativity that I had to hide was the same creativity that got me to where I am. Because in entrepreneurship, for example, I don't think innovation is going to be innovation if there was no creativity. If you didn't think differently, then everything will be the same.
Right.
And that creative mind allowed me to, like as a professor, for example, it allows me to allow my students to submit not just papers, maybe sing their homework. My one of my final projects is write a haiku,
Yes.
like a poem, encapsulating everything you've learned in class. And a lot of people think that that's easy. No, it's hard because a whole semester synthesized in a
In a
haiku,
haiku,
and
very difficult.
that's very hard. And that means higher level of thinking. When I learned that, Willayna, it's the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah.
It's like I didn't have to hide who I am. I didn't have to tell people I'm creative and you guys are not. No, I just am being me. And
Yes.
open conversations were in challenging things that we have done in the past in the department or in the organization, and finding a persuasive way. And since we're both like creative and we love to communicate, we use the a play of words to persuade people to think differently and make changes. And that's why I do what I do now. And I am very grateful for you, taking time out of your busy week. I know you've been traveling, and you gave us this opportunity to talk to you about how you just embody that of I am creative, analytical, right brain, left brain equal, and it's okay to be that. It's not a disadvantage.
For
It
sure.
is an advantage, and I really, really am very excited to ask you this question because our listeners, most of our listeners here, they want to be inspired, but at the same time, after the podcast episode, they don't want to just be inspired. They want to do something,
Sure.
right? So this is my question for you. It's a
Okay.
challenge for our audience.
Okay.
What's one bold step you'd encourage someone to take this week to push past that self-doubt or societal expectations?
I'd say one approach that I do all the time and that any of us can do, that it's in our full control. And again, this actually gets back to our self-talk, how we talk to ourselves, how we do the self-scan, is ask yourself 5 whys. So if you're having self-doubt about something, why do you feel that way? Write it down. Then once you answer that, ask yourself again, okay, well, why do you feel that way? Okay, well, why, right? Continue to write it down, but also after the 5th why, sometimes even after the 3rd or 4th why, but after the 5th why, you'll likely get to the real root of why you're feeling the way you're feeling, right? That activity, again, it's a simple activity, but it's not always easy to get there and do that self-discovery. But after you actually figure out the real root cause of what's causing the self-doubt, then you can look at it staring back at you on the piece of paper. And again, paper and pen. Like I'm very digital too. Put it on your phone, write it down, paper to pen, real quick. Once you see it staring back at you and you really get down to the root cause, then you know what it is. And then you can actually try to figure out how you want to address that thing. Because I've found so many times we're still dealing with kind of that surface level of why we feel something, when in fact the root cause of it is likely a little bit deeper.
Yes. And I love that way of looking at not just asking yourself one time, 5 times, because as humans, we're very good at doing. So, say for example, you have 10 things in your to do list, and I'm guilty of this. I try to tackle 5 things that are so easy,
Sure.
and then at the end of the day, I don't have enough time for the most important things in life. Because as humans, our brains are lazy. We go directly and I'm gonna do things that are easy. So when you keep asking why, maybe the first time you ask the why, you're not being as authentic. It's like I'm feeling this way because somebody said this to me. And then it's always outside factors, but not looking in, oh, perhaps I am, fearful. I'm feeling this self-doubt because I've always wanted to go back to school, but never did because I thought I'm too old for school.
Sure.
I shouldn't go back. So when you keep asking the why,
Yes.
you will be almost forced to tell yourself the truth.
Yes.
You are gonna, the
Yes.
first few times it's like, okay, I'm gonna be not saying what really I'm feeling and why.
That's right.
And you're confronted with the fact, oh, this is the fifth time, Willayna or Maria, you gotta tell the truth. You
It's
are afraid
hard.
because
No,
of
I'm
A, B,
serious.
C.
It takes courage to do it. It is a simple activity, but it is not always easy. So again, give yourself some grace. We all got to give ourselves some grace when we can, but that's a step for sure. Any of us could take this week if we're having self-doubt.
Thank you very much, Willayna, for this
You're so
wonderful,
welcome.
informative, informational, and courageous conversation. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of Courageously Speaking podcast, hosted by yours truly, Maria Soriano. Thank you, Willayna, for sharing this incredible journey of reinvention, but at the same time, teaching us how to strike that balance between embracing that unique self, but also pushing past our self-doubt. To our listeners, if this episode resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who could use a dose of inspiration, and visit www.couragecreatives.com for more resources to help you lead with courage and purpose. And remember, courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's actually about taking action despite it. So until next time, stay courageous.